In the frozen wilderness of Nevada, where even footprints vanish in seconds beneath the wind, a skeletal wild horse staggered toward an old wooden gate. No one knew where it had come from. No one understood why it stood still under the falling snow, unmoving for days. Until little Harper, a girl who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, stepped outside. And with just one gentle touch, both of their fates changed forever. That morning was so bitterly cold that every breath turned instantly into mist. Above the pale gray skies of the Nevada desert, the sun barely broke the horizon before being swallowed whole by a veil of frost. There wasn't a single bird in sight. The air had frozen still in Red Willow Valley, a place where every trace of life is marked by wilderness, harshness, and the unexpected. At High Desert Haven, a small wildlife rescue center tucked on the outskirts of Elkhorn Ridge, just a few miles from the Utah border, a shrill emergency phone rang at 7:03 a.m. Kyle, the overnight dispatcher and a former soldier turned coordinator, answered with a groggy voice. High Desert Haven. How can I think I see a wild horse. It's lying still at the bottom of the canyon. Might be dead. But something's off. A frantic male voice crackled through a satellite call. I'm on the southern edge of Red Willow, about half a mile east of the main trail. Kyle immediately patched the call through to Dr. Grace Callahan, the lead veterinarian. Within 10 minutes, Grace was at the center. At 45, Grace wasn't the kind of woman people found approachable. Her brown hair was tied back beneath a sun-faded cap, her thick coat worn at the collar, boots caked in dust each part of her. Speaking of the years she'd spent tending to wild horses, creatures the modern world had all but forgotten. Yet her gray eyes held a quiet force, something stern yet soft, like she could understand the things horses never spoke aloud. Grace didn't go alone. She called Bo Jameson, a longtime horse trainer born in Montana, now working as a consultant with the center. Bo was the strong, silent type, broad-shouldered, with a patchy salt and pepper beard. He wasn't a vet, but around these parts, everyone knew. No one understood horse psychology like Bo. The third member of the team was Skylar Reese, a woman in her early 20s, the youngest vet tech Grace had ever brought on. Skylar learned fast and had the gentlest hands. A newborn foal never flinched when she touched it. The rescue truck roared down a pitted, red dirt road, the desert wind snapping the tarp covering the back, revealing med kits, antibiotics, a portable heart monitor, and an emergency tranquilizer rifle. No one spoke. Red Willow Canyon wasn't a place people went, unless something was wrong. And when something was wrong there, it rarely ended well. If a horse lies in one place for more than 12 hours, it's never good, Grace said, eyes locked on the map on her lap. He ain't dead, Bo muttered, voice low and firm as granite. I can feel it. He's waiting. When the vehicle arrived, Grace stepped out first. They had to leave the truck at the hilltop and hike a steep, narrow trail half a mile down to the canyon floor. The mossy cliffs, the damp earth, all of it, sank slightly underfoot, a terrain where one misstep could cost a life. Red Willow was beautiful in a brutal way. Blood-red sandstone cliffs eroded by time, dry scrubland dotted with gnarled cedar trees, twisted like they were straining to hold on. Then they saw it. The horse lay in a sunken patch of earth, like the bottom of a dry bowl. Even in its stillness, it looked regal, like a statue carved by wind and time. Its coat was a dusty mix of silver and gray. Blood oozed from a deep gash stretching from its left shoulder to the front leg, jagged, raw. Yet it was the eyes that made them freeze, wide open, alert, cold. There was no surrender, no exhaustion like in other injured horses, just wariness, resolve, as if the animal was standing guard. "Oh my God," Skylar whispered. "That's not fear. It's protection," Bo said slowly, like swallowing ice. The horse lay curled in a crescent, head lifted slightly, ears pointed toward even the faintest sound. With every gust of wind, it pulled its leg in, shielding something beneath its body. "That posture isn't natural," Grace murmured. "Maybe it's pain," Schuyler guessed, holding the tranquilizer ready. "No, if it were pain, he'd lie on his side, not curled up like a shield. He's covering something," Grace said, stepping back. They waited, observed. For 10 full minutes, the horse never took its eyes off them. Each time Schuyler shifted even a little, it shook its head, mane fluttering, ribs twitching in pain, but never moving from its post. "Something's wrong," Bo muttered, pulling binoculars from his bag and focusing on the horse's belly. Sunlight sliced in from the ridge. He squinted, exhaled sharply. "I see something. Small, and it's moving." Grace felt her heart thump. Could it be a baby animal? Another horse? Bo shook his head. "Doesn't look like it. Color's different. Shape's all wrong." A black crow landed on a branch nearby. Instantly, the horse let out a guttural roar, low and fierce, echoing through the canyon. The crow flapped to one, startled. That wasn't the sound of a dying animal. It was the cry of a sentinel ready to fight, even while bleeding out. "Wait," Grace whispered. "We're not alone down here." The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridges of red willow when fog began thickening into heavy layers. The canyon air felt dense, oppressive. From where the three rescuers stood, only the wind's whisper through the rock crevices and the horse's ragged breathing could be heard. Each strained inhale an invisible tug of war between survival and something far deeper. Grace stood motionless. A strange instinct had awakened inside her, the kind honed through 20 years of working with the most stubborn, untamed creatures in America. The horse, though wounded, wasn't panicked, wasn't crying for help. It didn't want to be saved, didn't ask for aid. It was guarding, and what it protected wasn't itself. "Sky, give me the binoculars," Grace said calmly, hand extended without stepping forward. Schuyler quickly handed them over. Grace bent slightly, adjusted the lens, and focused on the lower abdomen of the horse. Beneath layers of red dust and dim light, something tiny moved. "There's something very small," Grace murmured, squinting hard. "Not a foal?" Schuyler asked, unsure. Grace shook her head. "No hoof prints, no signs of birth." Bo clenched the strap of his medical bag. His voice dropped. "Whatever that is, it's why he's willing to die here." All three held their breath. The horse lowered its head slowly, deliberately nudging its muzzle toward its belly, where the unknown object lay. A series of soft, low sounds escaped from its throat-like, gentle sighs, filled with affection. It was a sound anyone who'd raised horses would recognize, the tone of comfort. This couldn't be instinct. If the thing beneath it were prey or a threat, its survival drive would have made it flee long ago. But instead of running, the horse had chosen to stay and use its battered body as a shield. "Grace," Bo said quietly, eyes fixed on the scene. "I think I see fabric, something pink." Grace didn't wait. She gently took the tranquilizer rifle from Schuyler and laid it on the ground. Then slowly removed her gloves and raised both hands' palms open. "I'm going in," she said, her voice low and steady, as if she were speaking not to an animal, but to something living and listening. "We don't want to hurt you," Grace whispered with each cautious step, moving just a hand's length at a time. "We just want to understand what's keeping you here." The horse watched her. Its eyes weren't wild like earlier. They were resolute, fierce but not frantic, like a warrior defending a fortress. When Grace was within 10 feet, the wind stilled, as if the whole desert was holding its breath. The horse tensed, lifting its chest slightly, and in that moment time seemed to stop. Beneath its body, in a hollow of dust and rock, was a baby girl, 5 to 6 months old, wrapped in a dusty, wrinkled pink blanket. Her tiny hands were curled against the cold, but she was breathing, her chest rising and falling weakly. Wisps of black hair clung to her forehead, cheeks smudged with dirt. Grace gasped, hands trembling. Her mind struggled to process what her eyes saw. A wild Mustang, keeping a newborn alive? Oh my God! Skylar stepped back, stunned. Bo clenched his bag tighter, his eyes sharp and disbelieving. This can't be real. It's not just real, Grace whispered. This horse kept her alive through a desert night. In that instant, none of them were rescue professionals. None of them were adults armed with logic or training. They stood before something that defied every rule, even the boundaries of language. The horse, the four-legged warrior, lowered its head closer to the infant. With its rough muzzle, it touched the girl's blanket and let out a sound one Grace had never heard from any horse. Not a whinny, not a growl, but a gentle hum, almost like a lullaby. "That's not instinct," Bo said, voice thick. "That's will." Grace knelt, placing a hand on the ground. The cold seeped through her skin, but her eyes never left the baby or the horse's gaze. That gaze asked her, "Can I trust you?" Grace didn't blink, her voice soft as a prayer. "She needs saving, but I know you were the first to save her." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of cedar and dust. Far off, the sounds of morning echoed a distant owl, a breeze slipping through the canyon, and the faintest of whimpers. The baby opened her eyes, black, wide, wondering, and for a fleeting moment those eyes smiled. Grace choked back tears. "A miracle in the desert," she whispered. "A mother, not of our kind." The medevac helicopter from Elko Memorial had been in the air for nearly 20 minutes, and the pounding of its blades reverberated off the canyon walls like a bowstring stretched to breaking. Grace stood in the middle of Red Willow's basin, hands gripping the radio, her eyes locked on the horse. Sentinel, the name Grace had just given him, on instinct stood like a statue in the swirling desert wind. His left shoulder still bled, his front leg occasionally trembled, but he didn't budge. There was no hint of retreat. If anything, as the helicopter noise grew louder, he braced himself more firmly, guarding the infant beneath him as if ready to take on the world if it came too close. "You read me, Bo," Grace's voice crackled through the radio. "Loud and clear," Bo replied from about 80 meters away, where he was staking a marker flag for the helicopter's landing zone. "I told them there's an infant and a wounded wild horse. They thought I was joking." "That's fine," Grace said. "Just get them here. I'll handle the rest." Beside her, Skylar trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper. She held the rescue blanket close, her eyes locked on the baby beneath Sentinel's belly. Still breathing, still alive, but as fragile as a candle in the wind. "We need to get her out of there," Skylar whispered. Grace nodded and stepped closer now, so near she could feel the horse's breath on her face. He still hadn't taken his eyes off her. One gaze human and wild locked, together like hinges in a storm. "I won't touch her unless you let me," Grace said softly. "But if you've kept her alive this long, then let me help you keep her that way." She slowly knelt, her knees pressing into the cold dirt. The lowered stance, the smaller profile, it was an old technique she'd used when approaching traumatized horses after the wildfires in Arizona. No one had ever taught Grace how to communicate with a horse that was mothering in place of a human. The helicopter arrived with a 3-person medical team, led by Dr. Darian Brooks, a black emergency physician from Georgia, lean and sharp-eyed, a man who had faced more than his share of life-and-death moments on military deployments. But nothing he'd seen had prepared him for this. As he stepped off the chopper, the sight made him stop in his tracks. A massive Mustang, visibly wounded, lying sideways with a newborn nestled beneath him, and 3 rescuers standing utterly still, like figures carved in time. "Dear God," he whispered. Bo rushed to greet him, extending a hand. "Darian, thanks for coming. "I thought you were hallucinating when you called," Darian said, still stunned. "I've seen dogs protect children, but a horse? A wild one?" "Trust me," Bo said, eyes locked on Sentinel. "What you're about to see today won't be in any textbook." The medical team moved in from the perimeter. One tech raised a long-distance heart monitor. Another carried a neonatal stretcher. Grace raised her hand, stopping them. "He won't let anyone touch her unless he trusts them. I just need a few more minutes." Sentinel watched every motion. When someone moved too fast, he shifted to block. But when Grace stepped forward, he remained still, as if she alone had been approved. "Sky, hand me the stethoscope," Grace said. She gently knelt again and placed a hand on the pink blanket. It was dusty but intact. And inside, baby Harper Grace had already begun thinking of her by name, stirred. The infant opened her eyes. Though weak, her gaze found Grace's face. And Grace knew this child had survived not because of fate or chance, but because of the warmth of a horse and the protective will of a creature with no reins, no rider, no name. Grace slipped her hand under the blanket, checking the baby's pulse. Weak, but steady. Mild dehydration. But no signs of hypothermia, an almost impossible outcome after a night on the open desert floor. At that moment, Sentinel let out the softest sound since the team had arrived. Not a whinny, not a grunt, but a small, shaky breath. As if he was handing off the responsibility. "Thank you," Grace said, not to her team, but to Sentinel himself. Then slowly, she lifted the baby from the earth. Sentinel didn't move. His eyes no longer held the fire of a warrior, but the quiet sorrow of someone watching a child leave home. Skylar burst into tears as baby Harper was placed in medical arms. She spread out the rescue blanket, activated a warming pad, and followed Dr. Brooks' instructions to start a glucose drip. "We don't have much time," Darian said. "We're flying straight to Elko." Grace nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on Sentinel now, attempting to rise. His injured leg trembled, blood trickled from his shoulder, but he didn't collapse. He tried, step by painful step, to follow Harper, as if each hoof lifted was a fight against gravity itself. "My God," Bo murmured. Sentinel made it within 15 meters of the helicopter before stopping. He couldn't go farther. Just then, Harper, now in Dr. Brooks' arms, was being loaded onto the aircraft. The baby suddenly screamed a piercing wail, her first cry since being found. Everyone froze. Darian looked down, puzzled. Emotional shock. "We'll manage." But Grace didn't agree. She leaned down and touched Sentinel's forehead. "He's not just a horse, Darian," she whispered. "He's a gatekeeper between life and death." As the helicopter disappeared behind the cliffs, leaving the scent of jet fuel and the echoes of spinning blades, Sentinel remained rooted, staring into the empty sky. His duty was done, but his eyes still couldn't look away. Grace stepped forward and gently stroked his bleeding shoulder. Sentinel closed his eyes, didn't flinch, didn't run. For the first time since they met, he let someone touch him. "Now it's our turn to care for you," Grace said. "You didn't leave her behind, so we won't leave you either." And under a blood-red sunset, she whispered, "Not all hooves are wild, not all silence is without love." As the helicopter touched down on the rooftop helipad of Elko Memorial Hospital, the pediatric emergency team rushed baby Harper into the NICU. She was laid on a stainless steel exam table, the halogen lights casting a stark glare on her pale skin, stripping away all illusion of life. She was still breathing, but her heartbeat was erratic, and her tiny body began to react to the sudden flood of medical intervention, as if peace only existed for her beneath the belly of the wild horse called Sentinel. Darian Brooks stood at the head of the table, face tight with tension. "Establish an IV line. Full organ check. And run a DNA panel. I need to know who she is. A baby doesn't just show up alone in the Red Willow Valley. Something's not right. While the nurses and techs raced time, in a quiet room down the hall, Grace sat in silence. Dried blood from Sentinel's wound still stained her hands. Bo sat beside her, holding a paper cup of coffee, gone cold, eyes fixed on the pink blanket they'd just unwrapped from the baby. The blanket was old, frayed at the corners, but embroidered faintly with 2 letters. L. Jensen. Grace stared at the stitched name, then turned to Bo. "Do you see it? Jensen." Bo nodded. "Not an uncommon name. But if it's the only lead we've got, we follow it." "There's more," Grace said, pulling something from her jacket pocket, a charred scrap of lace caught on Sentinel's hoof. "I think someone was with the baby, and that person didn't make it." A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, rain began to fall, the first in 3 dry weeks, washing the earth clean, and perhaps stirring secrets still buried. At the Elko County Sheriff's Office, Deputy Mitch Lander stared at the facts sent from the hospital. Photo of the baby, items found, and a request: check all missing children reports within 200-mile radius. Mitch, a Montana native and ex-military, wasn't the sentimental type, but when he saw the words "found under the belly of a wild horse," he couldn't sit still. "You've got to be kidding," he muttered. "Red Willow's been locked off since the wildfire last October. No one's supposed to be in there, so how did a baby end up there?" He picked up the phone and dialed Detective Laney Croft, local investigator and longtime tracker of disappearances near the abandoned mines east of Red Willow. "Laney, I need you at the hospital. There's a baby, I think. It ties into that case you followed last summer. Remember that woman named Lara Jensen?" There was a long pause on the line. "You said what? Lara Jensen? The woman reported missing near Osage, had a baby under 1 year old? "Exactly," Mitch replied. "And I think we just found that baby." At the hospital, Harper had been rehydrated and stabilized, but remained unconscious. Her tiny body was still battling a past no medical test could explain. Grace stepped into the ICU for the first time since the rescue. This time, seeing Harper not beneath the belly of a wild horse, but on a cold bed, surrounded by sterile beeping and pale light. She stood there for a long time. Then she pulled from her coat pocket a tiny biscuit, the same piece Sentinel had refused when they tried to coax him into a transport cage. A small gesture, but one that convinced Grace that horse was something else entirely. Bo entered, carrying the freshly laundered pink blanket. He laid it gently over Harper's body. Unexpectedly, the baby stirred. Her lips twitched, searching for the familiar warmth. "She doesn't want to be away from Sentinel," Bo said. Grace nodded, "and I'm not sure we should separate them." Meanwhile, miles away at the edge of Red Willow Canyon, Sentinel was being housed in a temporary enclosure at Nevada Wild Trails Rescue Center. The veterinary staff bandaged his wounds and administered pain medication, but the horse didn't react violently. He simply stood still, staring out toward the horizon, waiting for a sound, a signal that never came. A young volunteer named Tucker asked the on-site vet, "Do you think he's waiting for the baby?" The vet sighed, removing his safety goggles. "I don't know, but since we brought him in, he hasn't eaten, hasn't acted out. He just stands there." Tucker knelt, looking into Sentinel's eyes. "You know, buddy, maybe you understand more than any of us." Back at the hospital, Laney Croft had arrived. She entered the briefing room where Grace and Bo sat. Opening her laptop, she projected an old photo. Lara Jensen, fiery red hair, sea-green eyes, holding a newborn baby. Grace stopped breathing. "That's Harper," she whispered. Laney nodded. "Lara went missing 6 months ago. No body, no clues. Just a brief note from a women's shelter in Elko saying she left, afraid her ex-husband was following her." Bo frowned. "You think this is domestic abuse?" Laney nodded solemnly. "Or worse. Her husband, Nathaniel Kerr, was convicted before for assaulting her. No one's seen Lara since. Grace spoke as if thinking aloud. Maybe. Lara fled into the forest with her child. Maybe Sentinel was the horse she rode, and when Lara was gone, Sentinel became the final protector. No one said another word. They didn't need to. The pieces were falling into place. Stitched together by a pink blanket, a hoofprint, a stormy night, and the eyes of a creature that could not lie. But the biggest question still loomed. Where is Lara? On the local radio dispatch, a call came in anonymous. I know that baby. I saw her, with a black horse, in the woods near Black Trail Canyon 3 days ago. Someone was chasing them, had a gun. I didn't interfere, but she wasn't alone. The operator tried to get more information, but the caller had already hung up. Grace sat beside Harper, now sleeping in the ICU. She held the baby's hand, her heart heavy with premonition. Sentinel had saved Harper, but Sentinel might also be the only key left to uncover the truth. 2 weeks after the rescue, Harper was steadily recovering at the Reno Children's Medical Center. The scratches on her skin had healed. Her vital signs were stable. But there was one thing none of the doctors could explain. The baby refused to sleep unless she heard the breathing of a horse. We've tried equine sound machines, barn recordings, even a heartbeat teddy bear, said child psychologist Dr. Nora Halberg as she sat beside Grace in the observation room. But nothing works. Every 20 minutes, she wakes up, crying, reaching for something. Grace looked through the one-way glass. Harper lay curled in her blanket, wide eyes open in the dark, as if waiting for the sound of hooves from a faraway place. She doesn't want to leave Red Willow, Grace whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Since Sentinel had been moved to a field treatment site deep within Black Trail Canyon, more sheltered and easier to monitor, the horse had barely left the makeshift pen. His left front leg was still healing, and though he allowed minimal handling, he refused contact from anyone but Grace. At first, the High Desert Haven staff thought it was just trauma-typical behavior from a wounded wild horse. But over time, they began to realize Sentinel displayed a consciousness that went far beyond animal instinct. When Schuyler brought in a portable heater, Sentinel stepped aside to avoid the wires. When helicopters flew overhead, he looked up but didn't flinch. Most striking of all, each afternoon when Grace played a recording of Harper's soft whimpers, Sentinel would walk over, lower his head, and stand still for hours. Is it possible, Schuyler hesitated, that he's looking for her? Grace didn't answer right away, but she started to wonder. 1 week later, at the Washoe County Family Court, a closed-door meeting was convened. In attendance, representatives from Child Protective Services, Dr. Nora Halberg, Dr. Darian Brooks, and Grace Callahan. You're suggesting returning baby Harper to Red Willow, where wild horses roam. The CPS official raised an eyebrow. Not just to wild horse territory, Grace said firmly, to the exact horse that saved her. The room fell silent. Then Dr. Nora presented research on imprint bonding, a psychological phenomenon where infants form deep emotional connections with the first being to care for them in critical survival moments. Whether that being is human or animal, she said, the baby needs reconnection, Brooks added. Otherwise, her emotional nervous system could shut down, triggering long-term trauma disorders. In the end, an unprecedented decision was made. Harper would return to Red Willow, where Sentinel was being treated under tightly controlled supervision. On Saturday morning, a helicopter gently touched down on a flat patch at the rim of Black Trail Canyon. Desert wind kicked up red dust. Grace carried Harper, wrapped in her familiar pink blanket, stepping out onto the soft earth. Medical staff stood by, and Schuyler held a camera to document every moment. Sentinel was beneath the shade of an old pine tree, about 50 meters away. The moment the rotor blades echoed across the canyon, his head lifted, his eyes widened, recognition sparking like firelight in a winter storm. As Harper was laid gently on the ground, she shivered in the wind. But from across the space, Sentinel stepped forward, not rushed, not wary, just calm, deliberate, each step pressing into the dust like it knew the path. "Oh my God," Skylar whispered, her camera trembling. He remembers her. Harper reached out her tiny arms. No one had taught her that. Somehow, she just knew. Sentinel stopped a few feet from her. Then slowly, he lowered his head, his muzzle brushing close to her forehead. A deep, long breath escaped him, low and steady, like a lullaby sung by the desert itself. Harper giggled. Her first laugh since leaving Red Willow. Her tiny hands touched his mane, as if rediscovering a piece of herself. From that day on, Harper began sleeping peacefully again. Each afternoon, Grace brought her back to the canyon to spend time with Sentinel. They built a small shelter, just enough to keep out the sun and wind, and allowed Harper safe, supervised contact with the horse. No one called it a miracle. But everyone knew it was something science couldn't explain. In her official report to the National Pediatric Medical Board, Dr. Nora Halberg wrote, "It wasn't just Harper who healed. We watched a wild horse, physically and emotionally wounded slowly, recover each time Harper arrived. It's as if the two of them are healing each other through shared presence." Grace called it cross-species connection. Bo called it something I haven't seen in 30 years of horse work. And Skylar, the youngest of them, said in her recorded journal, "Sentinel isn't a horse who knows love. He is love. He's the primal tenderness we forgot animals still carry." November swept into Nevada with its biting dryness, long white clouds drifting low across the sun-scorched hills of the Great Basin Desert. Black Trail Canyon was no longer just a field hospital site. After the story of Harper and Sentinel spread across local news and then nationally, hundreds of thousands of people had heard the name Red Willow, once a forgotten corner of land, now transformed into a symbol of hope and the miraculous. High Desert Haven, under a direct proposal from Grace Callahan, received state approval for an unprecedented initiative, transforming the Red Willow and Black Trail region into a semi-wild therapeutic reserve dedicated to nurturing rare emotional connections between humans and animals in their most primal forms. A small wooden cabin was built on the southern ridge where sunrise bathed the valley in light. It would serve as part-time residence for Harper, her mother Lindsay Monroe, and Sentinel. The cabin had basic amenities but no phones, no internet. Every detail designed for a single principle: preserve the wildness where humans and horses can simply be. On their first morning at the cabin, Lindsay stood outside on the porch. The highland wind tugged at her hair. Inside, Harper slept on a small wooden bed, still clutching her horse-shaped stuffed animal, a gift from Grace. Lindsay turned her head. Sentinel was lying beneath a yucca tree about 20 feet from the porch. No fences, no halters. Yet he never crossed an invisible boundary, as if he knew the exact space where humans needed breath, and where his presence was enough. "You think he'll stay?" Lindsay asked softly, voice as delicate as morning mist. Grace stood beside her, hands in her jacket pockets, and replied gently, "If Harper stays, then Sentinel won't go anywhere." A wild horse choosing to remain near humans wasn't unheard of, but a wild horse choosing to stay beside only one child and keeping distance from everyone else was something never documented before. Skylar set up a long-range wildlife camera to monitor Sentinel's movements. The results over 2 weeks. Sentinel never left Harper's side by more than 10 meters. Not once did he turn his back when she was outside. Every time Harper cried, even inside the cabin, Sentinel would lift his head, hold his breath, and wait. "That's not instinct," Bo said, watching the footage. "That's guarding. like a lead stallion keeping watch when wolves are near. Hard to believe, but since arriving at the cabin, Harper's development had accelerated dramatically. She began walking earlier than expected. On the day she took her first steps across the green grass, sentinel-like, he'd made a vow walked behind her, slowly, patiently, not rushing, not leaving. Dr. Nora Halberg returned for a routine evaluation and couldn't hold back. We're witnessing an emotional bond between an infant and a wild species unlike anything in modern pediatric records. Harper's emotional nervous system is developing at an almost miraculous rate. But not everyone celebrated the miracle. A few extremist animal rights groups posted public statements. Wild horses should never be confined, even voluntarily. Some media headlines accused the project of exploiting an animal for image building. Grace remained calm, as always. She said only one thing to a reporter. "We're not keeping Sentinel here. He chooses to stay." One afternoon, as golden light spilled across the red rocks, a group of elementary school students from Carson City visited the reserve as part of a special education program. Among them was a boy with autism named Max. He didn't speak during the entire trip, clutched his teddy bear tightly, avoided eye contact. But when he got close to Harper, who was sitting on the ground with Sentinel nearby, Max froze. He held out his teddy bear. Harper giggled, reached out, touched the bear. Sentinel lowered his head, gently nudging it. No one said anything. Max put the bear down on the grass and sat beside Harper. It was the first time he had initiated contact with another person besides his mother. That moment sparked a national movement called Healing Without Words, a campaign by the U.S. Department of Health and several animal advocacy groups. Grace and Harper were invited to speak at the National Children's Mental Health Summit in Austin, Texas. Grace declined the invitation. "Harper needs peace," she said, "and Sentinel doesn't like noise." Instead, she sent a video. In it, Harper spoke her very first word, not mom, not milk, but 1010, the name she used for Sentinel. Winter came. Snow blanketed the cabin roof and painted the hills in white. And Sentinel was still there, a living monument. Each night he stood guard outside the cabin, sometimes near, sometimes farther, but never gone. Locals began calling him the guardian of the borderland, not just because he watched over Harper, but because he seemed to protect something bigger, the last sacred line between humans and the wild, a gray zone where love needs no language. And healing isn't born of medicine, but of mercy. A winter storm swept through the Nevada highlands in early January, bringing biting winds and whiteout fog so dense you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. In the small wooden cabin where Harper and her mother stayed, an oil lamp flickered, casting the silhouette of Sentinel standing motionless outside like a snow-covered monument. "Is she still asleep?" Grace asked, shaking off the snow from her cloak and hanging it on a wooden hook. Lindsay nodded, voice soft. "She hasn't taken her eyes off the window all day. Sentinel's been out there for 3 hours." 3 hours in Cattertendig's weather with winds strong enough to snap branches. The wild horse hadn't moved, hadn't sought shelter, hadn't returned to a herd. He just stood there as if he knew something was coming. And he was right. At midnight, the low rumble of an engine echoed from beyond the ridge. Grace stood instantly, grabbed her flashlight. "No one's authorized to be here at this hour." She pointed the beam toward the trail leading into the canyon, where the harsh glare of a truck's headlights broke the stillness. Oman stepped out, hood pulled up, shoulders hunched beneath a heavy canvas bag. A worn insignia shimmered on his jacket, a torn patch from a now-defunct horse control agency once shut down for animal abuse. "What's this about?" Grace called out, staying on the porch. "The reserve doesn't take visitors at night." The man moved closer, eyes locked, unblinking. "I've come for the horse. Sentinel. He's mine." His name was Roy Lamber, once part of an illegal horse containment camp in Utah. According to him, Sentinel had once been branded, his ownership marked by a metal chip buried beneath the mane. When the camp was shut down, Sentinel escaped. Now, with the horse gaining national attention, Roy had returned to claim him. Grace's voice remained even. "There was nothing legal about the way you treated him." Roy scoffed, eyes cold. "Then let the courts decide." Right then, Sentinel stepped from the shadows, quiet as wind. He placed himself squarely between the cabin and the man. No whinny, no growl, just eyes lit with defiance. The calm presence of something that no longer feared. Roy stepped forward, hand raised in challenge. Sentinel lowered his head and slammed a hoof into the ground. A deep, vibrating thud rolled through the earth like a pulse. Roy flinched. "I'll come back with a court order," he muttered, turning back toward his truck. Grace watched the tail lights disappear behind the curtain of snow. Beside her, Sentinel's breathing remained steady. He didn't chase, didn't attack, but with his presence alone, he had protected Harper in a way no human ever could. 2 weeks later, Roy Lamber's legal claim was brought before the Carson City courthouse. Media swarmed the scene, but no one expected what came next. Sentinel showed up. No one led him, no trailer, no halter. But at sunrise, there he stood, calm, proud, unmovable right outside the courthouse steps. The lawsuit was dismissed. Roy couldn't provide any legal ownership. In fact, the reopened files from the Utah horse camp revealed old recordings, some obtained by Grace herself during her time with the Federal Rescue Force. The judge didn't declare anyone as owner of Sentinel. Instead, the ruling read, "Sentinel is a free creature with the right to choose his own life. No individual has the authority to restrain or possess him if he chooses to stay or go." From that day forward, Sentinel became a national icon not through ceremonies or festivals, but through quiet consistency. Every winter, people saw him return to the cabin where Harper was growing up. Every time Harper laughed in the sunlight, Sentinel stood just meters away, a silent echo of the past. He was no longer a broken horse, no longer abandoned. He was a hero without a human face. The guardian of a bond beyond words. A keeper of love that logic could never define. 3 years later, Harper could now speak clearly. In a school presentation titled "The Hero in My Heart," she shared a drawing, a horse standing in front of a wooden cabin with a small girl placing a hand over her chest. "That horse doesn't talk, doesn't carry me to school, doesn't read books. But he's there every time I'm sad. He was the first to hear me say his name. He never left." Her teacher asked, "Why do you call him a hero?" Harper smiled gently. "Because you don't have to be human to have someone." Somewhere in the snowy hills of Nevada, Sentinel still roamed, no longer bound by pain or fear. With every hoofprint, he carved into the red earth a story of a creature once dismissed as worthless, who became the cornerstone of an entire new life. And when people asked Harper whether growing up beside a wild horse was worth it, she simply whispered, "If not for him, I wouldn't still be here." If you believe that sometimes salvation doesn't come from humans, but from something wild and wordless, leave a 1 below. And if this story touched your heart in any special way, just type 0 so we know you're out there believing in miracles too. Don't forget to subscribe to True Animal Stories, where each week we bring you real tales of friendship, sacrifice, and the unspoken bonds between people and the creatures they never expected to love. See you in the next story.